If you ever feel out of control around food, you're not alone, and you're in the right place to learn practical, no-nonsense information about why you binge and how to stop. Binge eating does not mean that something is wrong with you. It's a natural but primitive brain response that you can correct. If you're ready for change, sign up for the Brain Over Binge self-paced online course for less than $20 per month. And if you feel you need personalized support, we also offer one-on-one coaching and group coaching. To learn more, go to brainoverbinge.com/subscribe. And I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the Brain Over Binge podcast, where you learn a simple, brain-based approach for ending binge eating. The title of today's show is, Are You Truly Binge Eating? This is something that's been on my mind for a while because although there's not one exact definition of a binge, and binge eating shows up a little differently for everyone who struggles with it, I think that the way the culture is using the term binge is making things more confusing for people who struggle with binge eating, and I just want to have a discussion about that. I actually had the TV on last night, and a commercial came on that used the term binge posting, and that immediately gave me the motivation to go ahead and record this episode. For a while now, I've been wanting to talk about the increasing use of the word binge in our culture. People have been talking about binge-watching shows for a while now, but I feel like it's extending to other areas of life. And it seems like almost anything that's excessive is labeled as binging these days, and that also applies to eating. I think it's become more common to hear people say that they're binging on food when what they're doing is far different from that destructive and life-altering behavior that someone with bulimia or binge eating disorder struggles with. This really hit home for me recently when my son actually used the term binging to refer to eating a lot of pizza. He has a big appetite and he's growing and he loves pizza, and in no way would I consider his eating to be binge eating. But he used that word. And the most interesting part about it was that his comment was actually pretty positive. He used the term in a positive way, like it was pretty awesome that he was eating so much pizza. Now, in the moment, it kind of struck me, and I clarified to him that binge eating is actually really harmful, and that wasn't the correct use of the term. But then I kind of got to thinking about it more, and of course I feel that way because this is the work that I do and because of my own history and my own perceptions and experiences. But in my son's world, among his friends and peers and pop culture, he sees the word binge another way. And I think that's okay for reasons that I'm going to explain. When I first started thinking about this episode, I kind of had it in my mind that I would be speaking out against this common use of the word binge in our culture, saying that we should not be using this term so commonly and thoughtlessly because it minimizes the painful struggle that binge eaters go through. But the more I reflected on this, the more I realized that that might not actually do much good. This word binge is really out there with all of its implications, and it's not going to stop because of something I say on this podcast. I mean, the commercial that I mentioned in the beginning was for the iPhone, so this is pretty big in our culture. However, what I can do is help you deal with this overuse of the term and help you understand that it does not have to minimize your struggle or affect your recovery. I can help you understand that when people use the term binge to refer to, let's say, eating too much pizza, they're simply innocently using the word in a way that they've come to understand it. It doesn't have anything to do with you or your behavior, and it also does not mean that binge eating has suddenly become really widespread. It just means people are misusing the term, and maybe misusing it is not even the right word. They're just using it in a much more generalized way to describe certain behaviors. It's not unlike people who say that they're so OCD when they go back to check and make sure their coffee pot is off. If you were to ask them, you would realize that they don't actually believe they have true OCD. They're just using that term to describe a behavior because what they're doing has some similarities with OCD. If you think about it in this way, I actually think the overgeneralized use of the term binge or something like OCD could actually become a positive thing in that it helps you not take a label so seriously. And I don't want to minimize the seriousness because eating disorders and OCD do have very serious consequences. But what I want to say here is that even people who clearly would not be diagnosed with OCD or binge eating can have similar thoughts to someone who does struggle with those issues. And they can have similar behaviors, even though those behaviors would not be formally diagnosed. Like even people who clearly would not be diagnosed with binge eating disorder can have desires to eat excessively, and they can follow those desires at times. It shows you that we're all a little more alike than we are different, and there are some universal things that humans struggle with. Obsessive thoughts and eating excessively are two examples of that. Of course, there's a point where obsessive thoughts and excessive eating become problematic and take over your life, and a point where you would be able to be diagnosed with a certain condition. But putting that label on it does not change that you're just further down the spectrum, so to speak, from someone who simply eats too much pizza or checks the coffee pot a few times. The point I'm trying to make is not that you're more diseased or broken than the people who struggle with lesser forms of these behaviors. It's actually to help you see that you're not diseased or broken. You're just dealing with a heightened and stronger version of what those people are dealing with. Your brain has been conditioned to drive you toward a harmful behavior in a more powerful way. And those urges are stronger than they are in other people. But I think it can help you see that that basic tendency toward excess is there in all of us. I looked up the term binge in the dictionary, and this is just for the word binge. It's not referring to binge eating disorder. And the Oxford Dictionary says that a binge is a period of excessive indulgence in an activity, especially eating, drinking, or taking drugs. So if we look at just that definition, then we can see that that basic tendency, as it's described, is sort of there in all of us. We all want to do too much of things that are pleasurable at times. We all want to indulge in our favorite activity now and then, and sometimes we may take it a little too far. And if people want to call that binging, then I think that's okay. I mean, after all, it's just a word, and words are imperfect ways to describe certain things. If someone eventually finds that whatever they're calling binging, as they define it, causes them problems, then they'll start looking for ways to correct it. If you're here listening to this podcast because you're trying to stop binging, you already know that your binge eating, as you define it, is causing problems for you. And that's all you really need to focus on. You don't need to worry about other people and what they're doing and whether or not their behaviors are binging. You don't need to worry about how the culture is using that term. And of course, it may make sense to correct people under certain circumstances, but your time and energy is better spent trying to correct your own eating issues that are holding you back. Okay, so all of that being said about the culture and its overgeneralized use of the term binging, I want to turn toward talking about recovery from binging and how we're defining it there. It's when talking about recovery that I think it makes sense to become really clear on what you're trying to recover from, what behaviors you're trying to stop, and it's very helpful to determine if you're actually binge eating in the way that it's defined in the eating disorder community. Because a lot of you may have a lot of experience with the cultural definition of binging, when you start to work on recovery, you may find that what you've been calling binge eating really isn't binge eating. You may find that you've been using that more generalized term to describe behaviors that are definitely a bit excessive, but not at all the same of someone who binges on massive quantities of food in a really out of control way. If you seek out a solution for binge eating and you are not really binge eating in the way that the eating disorder literature and research defines it, then the solution may not be targeted to your particular problem. So for example, you might start listening to my podcast or read another book on binge eating and not really be able to relate, and then find minimal help because it's not really what you're struggling with. I think that some of my ideas can definitely apply to people who are overeating or overindulging, but I'm really focused here on helping people with binge eating specifically. I think my ideas are most useful in dismissing the urges to binge. And I think if you start dismissing all urges to eat in a way that could be considered excessive, it could send you down the path of restriction and really dismissing too many desires to eat. Or you might simply need different strategies to deal with your other problematic eating habits that aren't necessarily binging. When it comes to recovery, it will help you to come to a clear definition of what an actual binge is for you and what it is not. Even though the term in our culture is kind of thrown around loosely, a binge is not just having a large amount of food for fun or pleasure. It's not indulging in your favorite treat. It's a very harmful and painful experience that I know you want to stop. Of course, there's always going to be some subjectivity in determining what type of behaviors you're engaging in, and there is often some overlap. However, I think it's valuable to determine what you're specifically struggling with because when you know what your problem is, you can better apply solutions. I've recently talked to my friend and colleague Cookie Rosenblum about this, and we've decided to host a free online class to help you determine if you're binging, or maybe you're compulsively overeating, or engaging in a habitual pattern of eating in response to emotions. We want to help you understand how we define behaviors like binge eating, compulsive eating, emotional eating, and we hope that our discussion makes it easier for you to find the right solution so that you can overcome each of these issues. This online class is going to be on Wednesday, November 18th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can register through the link in the show notes. For those of you who have listened to this podcast for a while, you'll know that Cookie was a co-host for the first 11 episodes, and she's also been on the show as a guest. She's an expert at helping people overcome problematic overeating, and we think this online class will be a good way to discuss a variety of eating behaviors so that you can move toward freedom from whatever you're struggling with in relation to food. I hope to see you there. Remember to check out the link in the show notes. I really appreciate you joining me today, and I hope that this discussion has been helpful to you. I'll see you again next time, and until then, I want to encourage you and remind you that you have the power to change your brain and live a binge-free life. The Brain Over Binge podcast is produced and recorded by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC. All work is copyrighted by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC, and all rights are reserved. As a disclaimer, the hosts of the Brain Over Binge podcast are not professional counselors or licensed healthcare providers, and this podcast is not a substitute for medical advice or any form of professional therapy. Eating disorders can have serious health consequences, and you are strongly advised to seek medical attention for matters relating to your health. Please get help when you need it, and good luck on your journey. Need more help? You can find all of our current and upcoming options for support at brainoverbinge.com.